Ian Dale.
Now, one of my favourite parts of the week is when I have a politician in the studio for a whole hour where you can really delve into subjects, and that's what we're going to do on the LBC Book Club tonight, because I'm joined by the former Chancellor of the Exchequer, Alistair Darling. Alistair, good evening.
Good evening.
Now, you have written a memoir of sorts. I mean, it covers your period as Chancellor. And normally books like this, they get a few reviews, they sell a couple of thousand copies, but this book has been number one in the bestseller charts. Did that surprise you?
Yes, it did. I was surprised when I sat down and I thought what I wanted to do was to write a history of what happened in the 3 years I was Chancellor, because we went through some momentous occasions, Northern Rock, the banking system virtually collapsing. Obviously, some of the things we had to do in relation to the economy are still with us, but what I didn't count on a year ago was the fact that, come this October, we are still dealing with some of these big problems, both in the economy and even today. People are talking about the French Dutch bank that's had to be broken up over the weekend. So I think that's one of the reasons there's a real interest in the subject. And also, I hope I've written a book that is not written for the usual Westminster crowd, but it's written for people far beyond Westminster who are genuinely asking themselves, why did all this happen?
Well, I read the book over the weekend, and it was rather different to what I'd imagined it would be. I don't know why it was, but there was so much drama in it. It read like a thriller at times. Did you set out to write a book that was that kind of style? No,
there were times when in real life it was more like a horror story. So
that's enough about Gordon Brown.
Just give you one example. When on the day that RBS finally met its end, I'd left Downing Street at 5 a.m. to go to a meeting of finance ministers across in Luxembourg. By the time we got there, my private secretary said, look, RBS's shares have been suspended. An hour later they've been suspended again, and that is the beginning of the end. And we knew that we would have to do something, but we didn't reckon on it happening quite the way it did, and it happened because of a leak of what had happened at a previous meeting. People just thought, this is the end, that's it. And then to take a call from the chairman of that bank, who I knew, and he said, look, that's it, we can't carry on. What are you going to do about it? Now, I thought that was, the first odd thing was he was asking me what I was going to do about his bank, although I did know they were in dire straits. And then I said to him, how long can you keep going? And he said, maybe 2 or 3 hours at the most. Now, this was one of the biggest banks in the world, and he was telling me that they were going to run out of money probably in the early afternoon. It's a bit like the captain of the Titanic consulting the ship's architect, and when he asked how long will it stay afloat for, and he said maybe a couple of hours, and by the way, there aren't enough lifeboats to be going around. Now, that is, none of that's made up. That is the drama of what was happening. And, there were other incidents in those 3 years that were equally dramatic. But I just wanted to tell people how it happened in a way that, that people could understand. It would be much nicer if I did write perhaps one of these boring books about how well the economy did and lots of statistics and all the rest of it, and 5 people read it. But it was a turbulent time.
Because, a lot of politicians, when they write their memoirs, they hold back a bit. You don't often get the full picture. But, this really is warts and all. You're quite open about things that you think, in retrospect, maybe that you could have done differently. Certainly that the Prime Minister, Gordon Brown, could have done differently. What reaction have you had from your colleagues who were in government with you at the time who've read the book?
Well, most of them, and all the ones that have spoken to me, and there have been a lot, have said, yeah, we recognise it. And, I think at a time like this, and, we'll come on, no doubt, to some of the things I describe in the book, that I think there are times when, politicians in general, and especially some of the commentators, almost assume that the public isn't ready to be spoken to properly in a grown-up manner about these things. When I said, for example, 3 years ago in a newspaper interview that I thought that we were facing the worst conditions we'd seen for 60 years and the downturn would be more prolonged than most people thought, I did that because I thought people are grown up to have enough to have a conversation with them. And if I start saying something different, like actually it's not too bad, or we'll soon be through this, what was I going to be saying in 6 months' time when that patently wasn't the case? So I think when I came to write this book, I'm off the front line now. I'm still a member of Parliament, but I'm not on the front bench. And I don't think this book would have had credibility if I sort of glossed over things that people know about or half know about. So that's why I've included them, because I'm not going to write this book again, and I hope that in 20 years' time, or maybe 50 years' time, it will still stand as an accurate record. And, most of my colleagues have been, kind enough to say that, that's what it is.
I'm just looking back at what I wrote on my blog after your interview with The Guardian with Decker Aitkenhead, where let's remind people that you said that what's coming is going to be the worst economic crisis for 60 years. And Gordon Brown wasn't, shall we say, very happy.
A trifle irritated, yes. Yeah.
That you had said that. And now, of course, I'm getting on this site and I've got a virus thing that's come up, which is not really very good.
So we'll never know what you said.
Anyway, I said... no, it's not going to let me see. Anyway, never mind that. But I mean, Gordon Brown's reaction was interesting because you said, well, the British people would be adult enough to understand what you were saying, but the Prime Minister wasn't.
I think the real problem was this, that his view at that time was that, he'd taken advice too, that he thought we would get through it in maybe 6 months or so. At that time, this is the summer of 2008, we'd had Northern Rock the previous autumn. The American bank Bear Stearns had collapsed in the spring. Banks, which borrow billions of pounds from each other overnight, over longer periods than that, were finding it difficult to raise money. And all the time, the Treasury was seeing the signals the economy was slowing down very, very fast. And it was happening. Normally, if it happens in one country, that's bad. But this time, it was happening in America. It was happening in most European countries. It was happening in the Far East. Everybody was going in one direction. And actually, I did an interview with the Times 3 weeks earlier, and their treatment of it was slightly different. I had given this gloomy prognosis, and I was going to see Leonard Cohen at what proved to be the first of many farewell concerts, but I thought this was the farewell one, and I wanted to be there down at the O2. And so they did a thing about, Master of Gloom, is going to entertain the Chancellor of the Exchequer. But the Guardian thing got picked up in a way that, I think, in retrospect, took most people by surprise. It was meant to be one of these sort of colory pieces that people do on politicians. There was lovely pictures of the northwest of Scotland, where half my family comes from. But then the reaction to this, it wasn't just our lot, though they kept it going, from commentators on the Tories who said this is terrible that he said that, the Liberals said that. It was completely over the top, the reaction. And yet, 3 weeks later, as I say, our entire banking system, not just British banking system, the world's banking system, came within hours of collapsing. So I just had a laugh last week when Mervyn King said it was the worst conditions ever. Nobody said it, and he said, "Oh, that's fine. You must be right then." It was completely different 3 years ago.
This is how I ended my piece. I said, my overall impression from this interview was a man with the weight of the world on his shoulders who hasn't got a clue what to do next. He sounded like a businessman who knows his company is about to go bankrupt, but cannot come up with a plan B.
I can see why you might have thought that at the time. And, to be fair to you for a moment, this was, when I did the interview, it was at the middle of August. The acute problems the banking sector was facing wasn't apparent to anyone yet. And when I say anyone, I mean anyone, because in America they hadn't realised how bad it was. In Europe, they were, in many cases, in a state of denial about it. And it was really only, in September that we realised the banking system was heading for a crash, and that's when we started developing the plans to deal with that. So you're right. If you'd asked me in the middle of August, what's your plan for the banks, I'd have said, first of all, actually, the banks weren't in quite the state that they turned out to be. But by the time the crash came, we did actually have a plan. And the difference then and where Europe is today, the fact that we could announce a very big, substantial programme to stop our banks collapsing actually restored confidence. Contrast that to what's happening today. On the economy, again, at that stage it was slowing down, and part of the judgment that had to be reached as to what extent do you carry on with government spending to support the policy, or to what extent do you throttle back on your spending. And again, that's a judgment that's a live issue today, as most people know, I think.
Well, we'll come on to that in a second. John says on Twitter, excellent interview so far. I might actually go out and read Alistair Darling's book. So you sold one copy.
We better stop now then, while the going's good.
Maybe we should, but then I might have a bit of empty space for the rest of the programme. Now, are you really seriously telling me that before this period, nobody anywhere in government, in the Bank of England, really had identified a problem with the British banking system?
No, problems had been identified. It's actually the scale of it that I think almost crept up on people. Because if you remember, in the summer of 2008, HBOS, as it then was trying to raise money from, in the conventional way they raised money from their shareholders, and they were struggling. RBS had one of the biggest rights issues in the world. The American banks were desperately trying to raise money. The continental banks, the bigger ones, were trying to do the same thing. It was really, I think what precipitated this whole thing is when the Americans allowed Lehman's Bank to collapse in September, and they did that I don't think it wasn't planned. I mean, that was a terrible thing about it. But they had no political capital in the bank to nationalise it. When I blocked the Barclays deal, there was nowhere else for them to go. They let it collapse. And within 3 weeks, the entire system panicked because people said, look, if they let one bank go down, the others can go down. Now, during that period, we, the Treasury, the Bank of England, were working on the recapitalisation plan that I eventually announced. But obviously these things take time. And, you're doing it against the background of rumour, counter-rumour, leaks and so on. And that's why I said at the start of this programme, it was unhelpful. There was a bit of speculation that actually led RBS, its shares to tank that day. Although the next day I was able to announce a plan which, as I say, because it was so large and so dramatic, it stopped it. And within days, you may remember, this is one occasion where Britain did lead the way. The Americans, the French, the Germans, other countries did the same thing. And that's what stopped the world's system from collapsing then. It is not, if you like, negligence on the part of planners all over the world that they didn't all plan for that. It's just the sheer scale of this. The potential catastrophe just blew up. And, we will no doubt come on to today. The thing that worries me is that today's decision makers forget that these problems are rather like a fire. You can have smouldering under the floorboards, but suddenly something happens and the entire thing blows up. And then it is very, very difficult to deal with it. Far better to try and deal with it, while you've got some degree of control.
I'm thinking Greece, but we will come on to that in a second. Well, I'm talking to Alistair Darling. He's written an excellent book called Back from the Brink. It's published by Atlantic Books, $19.99, but you'll get it cheaper than that if you're clever. We'll be talking to him a little bit about today's situation in the Eurozone. We'll talk about his relations with Gordon Brown, and there's a lot to talk about there, believe you me. If you've got a question for Alistair Darling, the number to dial is 0845 6060 973. The time now is 9:16. And time for the travel with Alan Joy.
Dale.
Well, welcome back to the LBC Book Club. It's Ian Dale with Alistair Darling this evening, the former Chancellor, who's written a book called Back from the Brink about his 3 years in the Treasury. Mark has tweeted to say, I'm a Tory, but I think history will treat Alistair Darling very well indeed. He used to be my MP. He has integrity. Well, there you are. You can appeal across the party divide there.
Well, that's nice. And it's always nice to meet a constituent, albeit a former constituent.
Indeed. 0845 6060 973 if you'd like to ask Alistair a question. Let's talk about bankers, because, frankly, the book really wouldn't be anything without them, would it?
No.
Whenever we have a discussion about bankers here on LBC, you can imagine what a lot of the phone calls are like. I mean, fairly vitriolic even now,
yes.
3 years on. People believe that the bankers haven't actually paid for the mistakes that they made. Would you generally accept that as a point of view?
Yeah, as a generalisation, but there's two important points here. Firstly, remember, there's a lot of this industry. When we talk about banks, we tend to talk about, the financial services industry, the city and all that. Remember, a lot of the industry didn't get into trouble. And, it is a fact of economic life that 10% of this country's national income comes from this industry. It employs 1 million people, not just in the city of London, other areas as well, my own hometown of Edinburgh. And also, when it came to, as I make the point in the book, when it came to the actual banking crisis, some of the bankers around the table didn't need to be there because their banks hadn't gotten the same into the same trouble as, say, the likes of RBS or HBOS and so on. I think, though, the ethos that allowed some of these mistakes to be made, particularly when banks got into areas they simply didn't understand, these complicated financial instruments where things like mortgages were sliced up and sold on, I'm afraid some of that is still there. And I find it. It's one of the things I find depressing is when from time to time I'll meet somebody still in banking, and they'll say, "Why is everyone so angry about us? If I went to Singapore, they wouldn't be like this." Well, maybe so, but I'd say to them, "You've got to understand that most people in this country." Just don't understand why it was they had to bail you out, and it's them now who are paying the price. The people who have nothing to do with banks whatsoever. So I think when you're asking me, do they fully understand as a contrition? Like every other section of society, some do and do understand full well and are, suitably chastised, if you like. Others are not. No.
Just relate the anecdote in the book about when you were talking to a banker about the size of his bonus, and said, "Well, could your neighbour?"
Yes.
Understand
well,
that.
In some ways, this is quite important to understand the psyche of people who spent all their lives in the company of bankers. And this particular chap, who I know and quite well, he'd got a bonus. I think it was about £2 or £3 million, and he was complaining about the bankers' bonus tax that I'd introduced. And in fact, he's more than complaining; he was very, very angry about it. And I said to him, "Look, it's a question of fairness." I said, "How do you justify this to your next door neighbour?" And he said, "Very easily." And I said, "Why is that?" And he said, "Because he got £1 million more than I did." And he was unintentionally making a point that if you get a group of people who only talk to other people who earn the big sort of money, you do get a distorted sense of reality. Whereas to most people, frankly, a bonus of £1 million is something they're not going to get, and if they got it, they certainly wouldn't complain about it.
The word bonus has almost been devalued, hasn't it?
Of course it
because,
has.
You and I would understand if I did my job really well here as an LBC presenter, and someone suddenly gave me a surprise bonus, I would really value that, even if it wasn't very much money. But
and it would encourage you to do better next year.
Exactly, but in banking, it's so different.
Well, you see, it's not just that the bonus is almost an expectation.
Yeah.
Like, come and work for us, here's your salary, but that doesn't really matter. You can get a big bonus. And, the other thing is that before the crisis, if you like, it was obvious that some parts of those banks were incentivizing through the bonus system their employees to take risks that eventually brought their banks down. And if it's not surprising if you pay someone a bonus to go and gamble with the bank's assets, to go and speculate in some of these exotic products, they'll do it. Of course they'll do it, because that's how they get their bonus. But someone back at HQ should have said, "Hold on, if these guys actually carry on doing this, you could bring the entire house down." Now, that is, when I used to say at the time, a bonus should be just that. A bonus means literally something that is good, and it should be there for rewarding good behaviour. It should not be there to as a matter of course, and equally, it shouldn't be there if you're actually incentivising someone to take risks, especially when it turns out the risks at the end of the day are met not by that bank. It's not as though it went down, but ultimately by us, the taxpayer.
Now, in a way, your book could have been titled The Domino Effect, because, you relate how various financial institutions got into difficulties. It was sort of one after the other. What would have been the consequences of letting one of the banks, let's choose Northern Rock as an example. What would have been the consequences of just letting Northern Rock go to the wall?
Well, one of the things that I talk about in the book, which is seared in my memory, is that in September 2007, when Northern Rock was clearly in trouble, it couldn't carry on, in the normal course of events, the Bank of England announced that it was standing behind Northern Rock. That is what lender of last resort means. When you can't go anywhere else, there's a Bank of England. And as I say in the book, the expression "safe as a Bank of England" ought to mean something. Now, everyone will remember it got leaked. The next day, queues started, and they were orderly queues, very British queues. No one panicked, no one was shouting. You frequently in the interviews, you'd hear people saying, "Yes, I know my money's safe, but I want to get it out." In fact, I remember seeing one lady coming out of the Northern Rock with her money, and she said, and she knew it was safe, but she wasn't going to leave it in Northern Rock, and she was filmed going down the road and into the Halifax. Now, as it turned out, had she had the benefit of foresight, she might have decided to go home and stick it under the mattress the following October. But the thing that struck me is that once, the people were panicking. It was a bit like, remember the fuel protests in the 2001, where the rumours went round that supermarkets were going to run out, and people went in and they stripped the place. It looked like a scene from Eastern Europe.
But it was, I remember thinking at the time, this is not my country. We've become an alien country somehow through our behaviour.
I remember both these incidents, and when it came to 12 months later with RBS, people have subsequently said, "Okay, why don't you we should have taught them a lesson, let them go. It wouldn't have stopped at RBS. If RBS closed its doors, the cash machines switched off, and remember RBS handles a lot of payment systems for companies, people would have been on to the next bank, then the next bank, and no government could have stood by with a situation where the population literally had no money. People couldn't go out and buy food in the shops or petrol or whatever. People would have panicked. And of course, the cost to the economy would have been absolutely colossal. Now, I dare say there'll be someone around who say, well, why not try it and see? Well, I wouldn't want to be the minister that decided that we would try it and see. Yeah. I'd seen enough. And, I say in the book that Northern Rock was a well-disguised blessing, and I can tell you it was very well-disguised. But I think that experience meant that 12 months later, when, Gordon and I discussed what should we do about this, we had no compunction of saying we will do whatever it takes to stop the system collapsing, because the price of collapse will be far, far greater.
But even right at the last minute, the senior bankers, the guys from the chief executives who you had into the Treasury late at night, they still didn't seem to get it. They still didn't seem to understand what was happening, which is frightening in itself.
Well, I did find that odd because, as you might imagine, we'd had them in 3 or 4 occasions during that difficult 2 to 3 week period, and all the time I was saying, look, we've got to stop a complete meltdown. What are the problems? And there were simple things like guaranteeing payments between banks and so on. So when I sat them down and I said, look, we all know the 2 problems. One is money to make the system go round. The other is some banks don't have enough capital. We have a solution to both these problems. And at the end of it, I spoke for about, 10 or 15 minutes, and I looked at them and smiled, and I expected they'd all look back and smile. We'll say, thank you very much. Let's put this plan into action. Because if it hadn't been ready for announcing when the markets opened at 8 o'clock the next morning, the entire system would have come down.
And that's how close we were.
Oh, yeah, because at that stage, if you've got the biggest bank in the world whose shares have been suspended, everybody knew that it had only got through to the end of the day because the Bank of England and also the US Fed in America had made sure it got there. If the next day there wasn't a solution, that you can just imagine what the markets have done. I know we're going to talk about today later, but over the summer there have been 2 or 3 occasions when markets have said there's no solution coming, and they start going after countries like Greece, even big countries like Italy. And you cannot allow a situation to arise where basically, instead of being in control of events, you're being knocked around. And that's why, with these banks, one of them said, what happens if we don't like this? I said, well, God help us, because, we don't have another plan. The other thing that I found was very effective was these guys, basically spend all their life negotiating and trying to get the best deal. So I had to announce all this the following morning. I said to them, I'm going to bed at 1 o'clock, and I've given instructions I'm not to be woken until 5 o'clock. And that did the trick. Gradually, everybody went home, and the next day we could announce something, and it worked. That's a crucial thing. And if it hadn't worked, my judgment would have been, into question. But it did work. But I should emphasise, around that table also, there were, banks that didn't actually need to be there, and they were very, very helpful. Oddly, some of the most, difficult customers were the ones who, frankly, I don't know where they were going to go, because, it's a bit like, trailing around London with a bouncing cheque. No one would have touched them. I mean, where were RBS and HBOS going to go?
Well, you're listening to the LBC Book Club with me, Ian Dale, and Alistair Darling. His book is called Back from the Brink. We'll be talking a little bit more about it in just a few minutes' time. This is LBC 97.3. It's 9:30.
With Ian Dale.
And coming up at 10 o'clock, David Cameron today appealed for the public to shop illegal immigrants as he pledged to reclaim Britain's borders. But Anthony Davis wants to know if this really is the right approach. Could this be open to abuse? Also, Justice Minister Nick Herbert today called for magistrates' courts to be open during the night and at weekends. But can you ever fully adjust to working overnight? Well, if somebody should know that, Anthony Davis should, shouldn't he? Do you really want a tired judge in charge of your case? And loads of BlackBerry users have been having problems with BBM and internet access today. Anthony would like to know how you've coped with the service. Well, I haven't coped very well at all. I feel as if my right arm has been cut off. All that and more with Anthony Davis from 10 o'clock. But before that, another half an hour with former Chancellor Alistair Darling, who's here talking about his book, Back from the Brink. 0845 6060 973. That's the number to call if you'd like to talk to him. Simon's in Cheam. Hello, Simon.
Hello, good evening.
Hi, what's your question?
Yes, to Alistair Darling. Thank you very much for taking the call, and well done for being such a good Chancellor. And I believe you saved the railways as well when you were in office as well. And us into the euro, would things been a lot worse now?
Well, hello, Simon. I'm not sure about saving the railways, but I hope I made some contribution to make sure they're in a better state.
Well, you're actually one of the few politicians who actually wanted to be Transport Secretary, which I have to say was always if I was in Parliament, that was always a job I wanted.
Well, ever since I had a train set, since I was little, I wanted to do that. And I think I was the second longest serving Transport Secretary. But anyway, on the euro, I agree with you that it was just as well that the then government decided not to join the euro, because, of course, it would have meant that the additional flexibility you get to allow your currency to change value would have meant you're in the same position as, some of the other countries in Europe that are finding it very difficult at the present time. So I think that was good. I think the other thing about the euro that people didn't, at the time, there was, a respectable body of opinion said that we should join, but to me there were two problems. One is you had to have the same interest rate for the entire Eurozone, and that resulted, for example, in Ireland, with them having interest rates that were far lower than they should have been, and they had a property boom which ended up in bringing down their banks, and then, of course, completely undermining their country. The second thing is, and today's events show that, if you've got a single currency, then you really need something approaching a single economic policy. Not necessarily a full political union, but certainly more cooperation. And I don't honestly think you can do that in a continent that is so diverse economically, never mind, in terms of culture and so on. So, yes, I think it was entirely the right decision. Frankly, I don't see us joining the euro in, anything like the foreseeable future.
Simon, thank you very much indeed for your call. Well, that brings us on to today's events. What do you think is going to happen in the Eurozone? Because it seems to me that Greece can't actually emerge from its difficulties unless it can generate growth, and it won't be able to do that while it's still a member of the euro.
Well, I think there's two things here. Firstly, I agree with you. There is no way that Greece is going to get through this now, and I've been saying that for months. The austerity programme that has been imposed on it is knocking so much out of its economy, it's never going to generate enough to repay the borrowing, never mind making inroads into the debt. And I also think that's going to be a growing problem in other parts of Europe, and we're seeing a bit of that here as well. So I think that is one problem. I think in the next, probably next couple of weeks, it will be announced that they're going to have to do a new settlement for Greece. The Eurozone is going to have a far bigger fund to shore up some of its banks. And I am quite sure it's not a question if Greece defaults, it's when it defaults. And I think it needs to be managed. A disorderly breakup would be a disaster. On the euro question, should Greece stay in the euro? I understand the argument that says, maybe they'd be better off out of it, and, the drachma or whatever they got would then devalue, but Greece would pay one hell of a price if that happened. The other thing is, it wouldn't stop at Greece. The markets, having seen this with Greece, the risk is they go to Portugal, maybe they go back to Ireland, or Ireland's doing a little bit better than people thought, and then maybe some of the bigger economies. I think it would be better if the Eurozone accept the fact that they're in it now. It's a political thing, they just have to accept that. But the richer, the better off countries like Germany have to help the poorer countries like Greece adapt. Now, it's going to be painful, but I think it is infinitely better. The breakup for the euro, and here, this is one thing I do agree with George Osborne when he said in the House of Commons this afternoon, the breakup of the euro would be a disaster for Europe, it would be a disaster for us, and probably a disaster for the world economy.
Now, if you were Chancellor now, and even if Labour had won the election, I suspect that Ed Balls would have been in that job rather than yourself. You make that rather clear in the book, I think. What would you be doing differently to George Osborne, apart from not cutting quite so quickly?
Well, I think that the difference between my view and George Osborne's view was this, that all of us would agree that you've got to get borrowing down. You come through a crisis. Remember, the economy was actually growing at the time of the general election. It carried on growing, for about 6 months after that, so that what we'd done had worked, but that was a time to bring your borrowing down. The question is, what rate do you bring it down? Bring it down too quickly, and the risk is you crash the economy. And it's now clear our economy has not grown for a year. We have a real problem now. On the other hand, if you ignore the problem, then you simply store up difficulties for the future. So yes, it is a matter of judgment, a matter of degree. But I just thought his approach was wrong. I had to laugh last week when he had sanctioned the additional quantitative easing, because when I did it, he said it was the last act of a desperate government, and clearly 2 years later it's not quite seen in that way. But there you are. So it is a matter of judgment. I think I think what you saw from the bank last week is the beginning of a plan B. I think our government here is now beginning to recognise that what they have done is that they have managed to choke off what growth we had. And if you don't get growth, your borrowing is going to go up, not down. And I think this is why they're going to have to look at things like maybe reducing the tax burden on basic rate taxpayers, bringing forward some big infrastructure projects. I mean, Crossrail, which actually we signed off, that's an example of where you employ a lot of people, that puts a lot of money into the economy. They're going to have to look at things like that.
Because quantitative easing can't work in the long term, can it? Because it will stock up inflation. I mean, that's a simple law of economics, that at some point it will cause more inflation than there would have been otherwise.
Yes, basically you are putting more money into the economy, and if you've got more money and the same amount of goods, then basically it puts prices up. The reason it worked 2 years ago was it was done on the back of a whole lot of other things that were designed to shore up the banking system to get the economy going. And the Bank of England last week calculated it, maybe put 1.5–2% worth of growth into the economy, which at a time of a downturn is no bad thing. This additional money will not, though, work unless two things happen. One is the government's got to make sure it actually gets out of the vaults of the bank.
There lies the problem.
Which it is not so far, because the Bank of England has been reluctant to do that. I think, secondly, on the inflation point, although inflation isn't the problem we face today, it's not. Of course, the inflation is running far higher than it should be. But the big problem for our economy is lack of growth rather than inflation. Whereas in the 1970s, inflation was a real problem. What I would say is, once you let inflation get into the system, if you don't take steps fairly quickly to get it back out again, it is really very bad, especially for people on fixed incomes and especially older people who've got no way out and they can't go and get a wage rise or something like that. So we should not ignore inflation, but I think the biggest risk that we face today, and I would not have said that if you'd done this interview in the summertime, the great problem we have now is I think growth has now come to a halt. That will mean more people out of work, and more people out of work for longer. It means businesses will find it a greater struggle, which is why I thought that on balance what the bank announced last week was a good thing. But on its own, it's not going to be enough.
Let's take a few questions from Twitter. Danny says, does Alistair still think it was a good thing to make Lloyds TSB take on HBOS? Now, you in the book, you actually put a bit of a different spin on this, because I had thought that this was something cooked up by Gordon Brown and Victor Blank together, but that's not the version of events that you relate.
That didn't happen, and it couldn't have happened, because you can't actually knock up, a merger of two banks over a glass of warm wine in a summer evening. I do say in the book there's a classic example of where someone thought it would be a good idea to portray this as, great government action and so on. And like all these things, in my experience, they can go horribly wrong if you're not careful. Actually, Lloyds and HBOS have been talking before they went near the government. They had to come to us because of the competition rules. But even after all this was agreed, the shareholders of HBOS and Lloyds didn't actually vote the deal through till the following January. So at any point in those 4 months, they could have said, actually, the world's changed, because remember, we did the bank bailout after that. We're not going to go ahead with this. But they decided, actually by a massive majority in both banks' cases, to do it. So no, just as it was unfair to claim, the apparent credit for, some drastic action, in a picture in the Financial Times, I think it was, it's not right to say that we forced them to do it. We couldn't. These were independent companies, or at least at that stage. I mean, HBOS, I don't think you could really describe it as being independent after it effectively went bust a few weeks later.
Nick has tweeted, are you still a socialist, Alistair, after doing the Tories' dirty work while Chancellor and have now written a book on it?
Well, yeah, it won't surprise you to know that I don't agree with what he says. I think. I can't think there's anything socialist about letting the banking system collapse. And the people who'd have actually lost out are people on low incomes, people, who don't have money behind them. They're the ones who'd have been properly, done over if that had been done the case. In terms of reducing the deficit, I'm afraid that's it's a fact of life. Again, you don't want, borrowing has to be serviced. The money that goes into paying for borrowing is money you're not spending on education, for example. So, funny, someone expressed the same sentiment to me in a cafe today, but as it so happens, maybe it's the same guy and you've gone home. I don't know.
No, I think this one's from Norfolk. So
no,
unless you've been in Norfolk,
I was not in Norfolk this afternoon, so it must be a different person. My apologies to you in respect of that.
Well, we're going to talk a little bit about Alistair's relationship with Gordon Brown after the travel. It's 9:45.
Dale.
It's the LBC Book Club with Alistair Darling, who's written Back from the Brink, published by Atlantic Books, 1999, in hardback. M says, I think Alistair Darling was a great Chancellor with Gordon Brown as Prime Minister, and I think they rescued the banks together in 2008, and other countries have followed what they did. I will definitely buy this book. Well, that's 2 copies we've sold for you,
thank you very much.
Tonight. Now, Gordon Brown. Now, you live fairly close to each other in Scotland. You've been political allies for the best part of 20, 25 years. And yet, the 3 years you spent as Chancellor, as you relate in the book, I mean, you kind of fell out with each other in a fairly major way. How did it start?
I think it started on day one, actually, because
really,
he, as I say in the book, he was genuinely in 2 minds as to whether he would appoint me or Ed Balls. And he had worked with him since 1994. And he worked with each other every day. And if he'd said to me, "Look, I thought about it, and despite all the stuff that's been written over the years, I've decided to go with him," I'd have lived with that. And Gordon was, he's asked me right at the start. He said, "What job would you like?" rather than "I want you to do this." So it was perhaps indicative of our relationship. And I wanted to do the job. I wouldn't have done it otherwise. I think you have to want to be the Chancellor. It's not something you just
because you'd been Chief Secretary before, so you kind of knew what it entailed.
I knew the Treasury. I'd been there 10 years earlier, so of course I knew what it entailed. But at the time, everything was going absolutely fine, or so it seemed. I think that on the banking issue, we were at one. We'd have the occasion, of course, you'd have healthy discussions about what you do and so on. It was really on the economy, and especially, I think things changed markedly when I did that interview that we discussed earlier with The Guardian, when I said it was the worst downturn in 60 years, when he quite clearly had a completely different view, and he was clearly very upset about it. I was equally, and things never recovered from this when the spin doctors and so on then start briefing against you and saying how awful you are and all the rest of it. People tell you it doesn't matter. Well, it does matter.
But you fought back from that, didn't you?
Well, yeah, I did because I thought I am not going to be driven out by people like this. And when it came to the summer of 2009, when he actually decided he did want to move me, which was his right, I said, okay, that's fine. If that's what you want, I will go. But I'm not going to hook Klingon to office because I thought that would have been absolutely pathetic. To be agreed to be the Secretary of State for drought or something like that, to simply be on the payroll, if you like. I said I would go. Now, of course, because of his weakened political position, then he wasn't able to move me, and so I stayed. And of course, half of me also said, why should I? Just at the time when I can see we're getting out of this, and we were, because actually the economy started to grow at the end of 2009. Why should I be forced out? But I think it did take its toll. Now, we're grown-ups. We'll get over it. But I think Richard Crossman, when in his memoirs, which he published in the late 1960s, I think he said something along the lines that political friendship shouldn't be personal, and maybe there is something in that, because it's a professional relationship. If you know each other and you go back a long way, then when you fall out, and prime ministers do fall out with chancellors, Margaret Thatcher fell out with 2 famously, it can be very difficult.
Talking of political friendships, what do you make of all of this Liam Fox situation at the moment? Because, that's all about friendship in a way, but his friendship with this Adam Werrity. Is it possible to have a real friend in politics anymore? Yeah.
Of course it is. Of course it's possible to have friendships, and it's also possible for you to have friends that are, not MPs or ministers or anything like that, but maybe operate in areas you deal with. What you've got to avoid, and this is where I think Liam Fox has come unstuck, is where the boundary between what you do as Secretary of State and what your friend does cross. I just found it astonishing that he goes to meetings with, foreign ministers and so on, and this guy's sitting in the back. Now, you can't do that. And equally, I don't know why this guy had his name card saying advisor to Liam Fox. When he patently was not. There's something very odd about it. Now, Liam Fox has apologised. He's explained that in the end of the day, there wasn't any wrongdoing. Well, the inquiry will establish all that. But I think you do have to be careful not only to do right, but to behave in such a way that if someone challenges you, say, well, actually, no, there was a boundary. And the other thing is, which again, I think Liam Fox said in the House of Commons today, people criticise the civil service a lot. It's easily done. actually the civil service and your private secretary is there as much to help you, but also to protect you. Because if someone had been there and taking a note, they could then say, well, actually, they discussed the weather or they discussed the view or something. They didn't discuss a defence contract or something like that. So I think he's got himself into difficulties because he allowed, or appears to have allowed, that sort of boundary to become blurred. And, it's not too difficult to say, look, this is my professional life. We can be friends outside this, but you can't blur it.
Has your friendship with Gordon Brown come to an end after your experience working with him?
No, as I say in the book, we were never sort of bosom buddies. We didn't go to football together or anything like that. But we've always been friendly. He will no doubt take some of my criticisms, hard. Just as
so you haven't spoken to him since the book came out?
Well, I haven't, but I wouldn't read too much into that because actually, since May 2010, after the election, that is, we really haven't seen very much of each other. I think both of us have probably come to the view that a period of, if not silence and certainly separation, might be mutually beneficial. But we're at our age, you ought to be grown enough up to deal with these things.
Was he psychologically fit to be Prime Minister? Because it's not. I mean, you've described some fairly volcanic scenes in your book. We've had the Anthony Seldon book. We've had Peter Mandelson, Tony Blair, Alistair Campbell. You all paint exactly the same picture of him.
No, there was no reason why he couldn't have, been a successful Prime Minister. I think, I'm afraid that the truth is, in some ways, a little bit more, prosaic. Really, from the time of the election, remember all the speculation about whether we should have a general election in 2010. The way it was handled and the way it was called off blew any political capital we had in the bank, and I don't think we ever recovered from that. Many people, he can be sometimes difficult to work with. And, as I say in the book, it would have been so much better if we had our disagreements, if we sat down and worked our way through them and then come to views to how to go forward. But that simply didn't happen. I'm sorry about that. Not just on a personal level. I'm prejudiced here. I'm sorry that because we got so distracted with a ridiculous argument about Labour investment against Tory cuts, that it allowed the Tories to say actually the argument is about telling the truth and not telling the truth, which comes back to the point we started on. That I think that the British public is actually far more mature than many commentators and politicians sometimes assume. I'm not saying it's plain sailing, but a good starting point is reality.
What's the future for you? Because you're not ready to go into your dotage. I think you're
certainly not.
You're 58.
Mm.
You said
57 3/4. I think actually.
I do apologise. Well, you make my case for me. But you said recently that you were going to take a year out. Might you return to the front line? Might you return to the shadow cabinet if asked?
Well, look, you never say never in politics. But, I've been on the backbenches now for, 16 months or whatever. And I must say I've quite enjoyed it. I've enjoyed, when a radio programme phones up and says, will you come on and do this? And I say, no, I don't want to do it because, for whatever reason, I can do that. And actually, when the book came out, it reminded me of all the reasons why I didn't. Because, of course, I've had to do, as you might imagine, endless interviews and so on. On the other hand, the longer I'm out of it, the more, especially when things are going on at the moment, I do want to become involved in that. I hope I've still got something to contribute. But certainly, here's me and, in fact, all politicians pointing out we're all going to have to work longer. There's no way that I either feel like or want to or could possibly retire and get the slippers next to the fire or anything like that. No, of course I'd like to do something else, but where I do it, I don't know. Well,
I asked the question because, of course, Ed Miliband's just done his shadow cabinet reshuffle. He's brought in some very young faces, some quite dynamic young faces. Yes. But every shadow cabinet, every cabinet needs a balance, and a bit of grey hair sometimes goes a long way, particularly in these situations.
Yeah, you're right that it's a big mistake if we think we live in a world where if you hit 50, you've had it. And
as I'm about to.
Well, your way of saying you're 10 years younger than I am. And you're also right. Actually, I make this non-partisan point. On both sides of the House of Commons, there's some very, very good new people have come in, and the House of Commons badly needed that. And I hope, these people come forward and do well in the future. But yes, there has to be a balance. I'm not ruling anything out, but, happily, Ed has just done his reshuffle. It would be some time before he does his next. And by that time, I'll be pretty clear about, what I intend to do. We'll be halfway through the Parliament next year.
What about the Bank of England? I mean, we've only got a couple of minutes left, but do you think that the Bank of England needs reform?
Yes.
You lay out in your book that the contretemps you had with Mervyn King, the governor, How would you reform the Bank of England?
Well, actually, this isn't personal to Mervyn, because Mervyn will not be the governor from 2013 onwards, and the new legislation that the government's putting through will come in then. Its governance needs to change. The idea of having a governor, as being the sole voice of what's right and what's wrong is needs to change. It's already been changed for fixing interest rates. The governance of the Bank of England, I think it should be more a governor and a board of directors. They're taking on a lot more responsibility. They need to be accountable. By happy coincidence, I'm giving evidence on this in the House of Commons Committee tomorrow afternoon.
Well,
so if you're desperate, there is more then.
Thank you very much indeed. Well, Alistair Darling, it's been an absolute pleasure over the last hour. Your book has sold very well so far. I think you've sold at least a few hundred more tonight. Alistair Darling's book is Back from the Brink. It's published by Atlantic Books in hardback in 1999. I'll be back tomorrow at 7. This is LBC 97.3. Anthony Davis, it's all yours.
Thank you very much, Ian. Yes, join